And our speaker for the very last session of the day is Richard Guy Wilson, who holds the Commonwealth Professor's Chair in Architectural History at the University of Virginia. A frequent lecturer for universities, museums, and professional groups, and a television commentator for America's Castles, American Experience, and the History Channel, he also has published many articles and books, including McKim, Mead, and White Architects, that was printed in 1983, The Making of Virginia Architecture in 1992, Thomas Jefferson's Academical Village, The Colonial Revival House, and Harbor Hill, Portrait of a House. He has led the Victorian Society's 19th Century Summer Course in Newport, Rhode Island for 29 years, and he's received the Outstanding Professor Award in 2001. And in 2007, he was the Thomas Jefferson Fellow at Cambridge University. His talk today is entitled Washington Aesthetics, J. Carter Brown and the CFA, from 1971 to 2002. Please welcome Richard Guy Wilson.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Okay back there? Good. Let me just say that first I'm very honored to be here, and I do want to acknowledge that my talk is dependent upon, they're not responsible for the mistakes, but it's dependent upon many people, but in particular Sue Kohler, Kay Fanning, Eve Barsom. They've all helped me out, and many other individuals at different archives, at National Gallery of Art and so forth here in Washington, D.C. Descriptions of J. Carter Brown's tenure on the Commission of Fine Arts might range, or have ranged, from, quote, a reign, the Pope, a dictator, a patron, a political accommodator, and a postmodernist. And I will address some of these in my talk. But underlying all of this, I think, there emerges an attempt on his part to provide an understanding, or perhaps to create or to recreate an aesthetic for Washington, D.C. He occupied the chair of the Commission of Fine Arts from 1971 to 2002, which is to date the longest reign of any individual, and the projects with which he was involved were, I think one can say, some of the most controversial. And they range from memorial mania, with literally hundreds of projects that are put forth, and some of which, as we know, have been constructed. Many museums, the balkanization of museums, one might say, and then many, many other things, from Hartman and Cox's Naval Memorial to the never completed, of course, but the Frank Gehry addition to the Corcoran Museum. Now, behind all of this, there are several things to keep in mind. That his 31-year chairmanship included at least 310 meetings. We academics think we have it bad, but that's pretty bad. The review of perhaps 4,000 projects, the signing of at least 10,000 letters, not to speak of the numerous testimonies and public speaking engagements involving the commission. And he also wrote a number of articles on the commission. Other issues included the attempt by the Reagan administration in 1981 to disband the commission totally, which failed. Also severe budget cuts. In another political move, the commission is relocated from Lafayette Square, which of course, near the center of power, to here, of course, this wonderful building, to here. Another issue involved membership on the commission. Traditionally, as we've been hearing, the commission was composed of leading architects, artists, and sculptors, landscapists, and some knowledgeable individuals. But beginning, and I know this is very tricky ground right here, but in the Nixon-Ford administrations, wives of politicians and individuals with lots of money and little qualifications got appointments. Now, certainly not everybody that served during Carter's time lacked knowledge. But it is apparent that some of the individuals knew little about what they were doing. And consequently, as has been pointed out to me by a number of individuals, frequently Carter was about the only person on the commission who really knew what was going on. Now, I also ought to note, and that's what I'm attempting to show on the left, that, of course, assisting the commission, as we've been hearing, were many individuals, Charles Atherton, Don Myers, Sue Kohler, Jeffrey Carson, and others. And indeed, the complete history will include many other individuals. As far as Charles Atherton, just simply to note that he and Carter had an interesting relationship. They worked very closely together. Obviously, for the years, there were certainly tensions that at times did develop between them. But still at the same time, it seems to me evident that overall there was a mutual respect. Now, to understand Carter Brown and his dates are 1934 to 2002, a brief background, I think, is necessary to put into perspective what it is that I'm talking about. He was the son of John Nicholas Brown II, and his father's dates are 1900 to 1979. Carter grew up partially in Newport, Rhode Island, where his grandmother, in about 1900, commissioned both of these buildings right here, the Emmanuel Episcopal Church and Harbor Court. Harbor Court is now the headquarters of the New York Yacht Club in Newport, Rhode Island. But both of these, as you can see, are by the great Boston firm of Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson. And indeed, of course, back in Carter's background, Brown University, Joseph Brown, the First Baptist Meeting House on the left, it's on College Hill in Providence, Rhode Island, and this is the other place where he spent his youth. And indeed, as he would look around Providence, Rhode Island, it would be impossible to escape the impact of the architecture of his forebears, whether it is the Providence Public Library on the bottom, which is basically funded by Brown money, or the J.C. Brown Library for rare books and Americana at Brown University on the top. In other words, he grew up with a heritage. And then, to even further compound this, that his father, John Nicholas Brown II, excuse me, at the age of 20, commissioned Ralph Adams Cram once again for another building, and this is the chapel at St. George's School in Middletown, Rhode Island, which is right outside of Newport. But then his father would follow this with this. And this, of course, is the Fisher's Island House, the Windshield House, the famous Windshield House by Richard Neutra. This is Richard Neutra's first East Coast work. And of course, in the history of American modernism, is an extremely important building. To put a little perspective, on the left is a dollhouse that Carter played with as a child at Harbor Court. And on the right, his father, I should note, attended Harvard University. John Nicholas Brown II attended Harvard University and studied art history, became a major collector of paintings, Cezanne and others, as well as furniture by Paul Frankel, and commissioning the buildings that I just showed you. Carter did attend St. George's School, but he also attended Stowe School in the English Midlands, with, of course, the very famous gardens that are there. I'm not going to go on too much more with his background, except to say that he did attend Harvard University, but he rebelled slightly from his father in that he studied history and literature rather than art history, and then he went on for an MBA. But after that, his interest in art, which had always been there, rekindles. He goes to Europe. He actually goes to Itati, and is with Bernard Berenson there. And the art history bug really begins to catch him. Travels in Europe, comes back to this country, and enters the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University, where he intends on attaining a PhD. And as he said in one of his memoirs, that I followed the observation of Fisk Kimball that it's easier to get a PhD than to explain why you didn't get one. But he did not get a PhD. He got a master's degree, a master in art history, because instead, in 1961, he was recruited by John Walker at the National Gallery to become his assistant. Carter is, of course, the person on the far left, and then John Walker on the right. This was followed in 1967 when he was put in charge of the East Wing, the new building. And then in 1969, he was made the director of the National Gallery of Art at the age of 34 years old. Those that know him or knew him do remember a very charming individual. He was especially well known for his loquaciousness with women in elevators, but also, of course, his career at the National Gallery. And that is a book in itself, and what he did there. I think it is safe to say that Carter, along with Thomas Hoving at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, really helped to transform the American Art Museum, the blockbuster type of exhibits, and all of this. Now, Carter, though, was aesthetically, one might say, both hands, acey-deucey. He, on one hand, could recommend Alan Cox to complete the murals in the U.S. Capitol. Now, you might very well say, well, what else was he going to do? But still, he is the person who got Alan Cox the commission to complete the murals in the Capitol. And at the same time, of course, the Motherwell, which we all know from the National Gallery of Art, represents the other side. There are, though, a couple of things that I think do emerge from Carter and from his background. That he loved all of the arts. Music was a passion of his. But still, architecture seems to be one of the major themes that does run through his life. Several individuals in the course of doing research on this have recounted to me that Carter told them that if I had to do it all over again, I would have been an architect. And that architecture really becomes his passion. Now, especially where I think that while there's certainly, as I've been pointing out, this is in his background and so forth, where it really begins to come to the fore is with the East Wing of the National Gallery. And his involvement there, especially with I.M. Pei. I.M. Pei has said that really it is Carter that is responsible for the atrium. Yes, Pei did have the idea, but it's Carter that pushed it through. And Carter became very intensely involved in the construction of the building, following it in almost every detail. This I.M. Pei connection is extremely important. They toured together in Europe while the museum, when the museum was in a design sense. As Pei recalled, here was a man who was an art historian, and he knew as much about architecture as I can claim to. And he goes on, and he says, and he was very interested in urban design. And it also comes forth that Carter Brown was not loath to giving his opinions, even to I.M. Pei, criticizing different aspects, not only the design of this building, but of other I.M. Pei buildings. As I say, the interest in architecture in Carter Brown can be seen, for instance, here. Friedrich St. Florian, in an interview with him, talked extensively, of course, about Carter's involvement in this project and so forth, and I'll be coming back to it in a few minutes, but also that he was intensely interested in all of the elements of it, reviewing the designs. And Friedrich St. Florian gives Carter the credit for the rope, and that's the reason why for the detail in the lower right, as the element that ties together the different pylons that are around it. On the Vietnam Memorial, to show a different angle with Carter, and there are, of course, many ways to read this, But one thing that does come across from all of the extensive testimony and involvement and so forth is to some degree that Carter really was protecting Maya Lin in this, that he recognized and he liked the design, but at the same time he could realize just exactly how much she could be beaten up. And it is very much, I think, of a protective act in his part. But still at the same time with this, and this is from him, he knew full well that with the Vietnam Memorial, some sort of a compromise was needed. And he wrote that while some of the commission members, such as Walter Netsch, who was a partner of the Skidmore firm from Chicago, felt that nothing should be added, and while I too, this is Carter, while I too thought the memorial was superb, still, if we refused to compromise, there was the risk that the whole design would be discarded. And hence, I quote, I persuaded my colleagues to agree unanimously that in principle the sculpture and flagpole be added. But of course, as we all know, and that's what I'm attempting to show here, that it is placed off the axis and not in the position that was originally suggested by those that were protesting it. In many places, Carter expressed his philosophy about the Commission of Fine Arts. And this is not on your syllabus because I understand it's out of print, but a book that was edited in 1991 on the Mall, and Carter actually contributed two articles to it, one on the East Wing, and secondly here on the Commission of Fine Arts. And I would suggest this to you. But his aesthetics, and as I've been indicating, are complicated. And they come from a variety of different sources. In numerous of his talks, he cites different cities. Charleston, South Carolina, once or twice, College Hill and Providence, Rhode Island, and Washington, D.C. And indeed, he says, in one of these essays, having lived most of my life in areas that embody this scale, first in College Hill and Providence, then 6 years at Harvard, and then at Georgetown and Washington, I am perhaps overly sensitive to that particular rhythm and text. But it works in Europe, and there is not reason that it should not work in those cities of America that have rightful claim to it. And so it is with this sort of a background here, or of the Georgetown background there, that we have to recognize this. He recognized, of course, that there are different characters of American cities. That New York, with its extraordinary skyline, he said, may be a bit more beautiful to look at than actually to be within, end quote. And in the end, what he is claiming is that Washington, D.C. had a special type of a character, that it was unique, and that that character needed to be understood and it needed to be respected. The consequence of this is, and for instance here, both he and Charlie Atherton got into a lot of fuss over this, but their testimony and so forth over some of the construction that was going on across the Potomac River, both in Crystal City and in Arlington. High-rise buildings were acts of urban vandalism. He felt that there should be a proportion of the height to the width of the street. He was very conscious of Washington, D.C.'s history. And wherever he spoke, he shows his knowledge about it. Not just simply the L'Enfant plan, and of course Thomas Jefferson's been mentioned many times today, but it's part of my contract at the University of Virginia that I have to mention him in every talk. And for Carter, he recognized the role that Thomas Jefferson played in L'Enfant's scheme, and that's Jefferson's scheme for Washington, D.C. On the right. And onward, Boss Shepard, importance of him, the McMillan Commission, which he called an all-star team. But to be more specific, what are some of the elements that are part of what we might say would be an aesthetic that Carter tried to develop for Washington, D.C.? One would be the site visit, which of course is not new, but that he considered it to be essential, especially when he was dealing with individuals who really had no knowledge about what it was. The site visits at times could be apparently rather interesting, that there might be almost a caravan of cars that would be showing up, and at times Carter would be traveling alone so that he could do work in his car and not have to jabber too much. But here we have two different site visits. You can pick him out on the left there, gesturing on the right. That's him with the commission about 1978, and indeed the individual, does this show up? No, excuse me, go back there. Well, anyway, it doesn't show up, but the fellow with the bow tie is Frederick Dovington Nichols, who was also a professor at the University of Virginia and a member. Beyond this, what else? He outlined these in a couple of different talks. Number one, the streets as embodiment of the city plan, that the streets are the setting of the sense of order. They provide the framework of distances, of view sheds, and the superimposition of the orthogonal on the grid. And of course, the importance of the different squares, whether it's DuPont, Thomas, Farragut, you name it. Streets as connecting links. 16th Street with its axis. Capitol with its axis. The Mall, that each of these had an axial importance and that they had to be respected. The streets is a special place, and the location of different sorts of buildings on them, whether it would be the foreign embassies on Massachusetts Avenue or 16th Street, the importance of trees. And in his various memos, commentary, and so forth, especially at the National Gallery of Art, lots of commentary about the trees of the streets and so forth, that they are, and I quote, are one of the great assets of Washington, a feature the foreign visitor never fails to comment on. No building can exceed in height the width of the street plus 20 feet. That there's a special quality, to Washington, D.C. These leads in different ways to different sorts of points of view. It is very clear that while the World War II memorial was shifted around and that there were a variety of different sites that it was planned for, that ultimately its location, where it is very much the work of Carter Brown. At the same time, it's also worthwhile to note that the way that he wanted it and the depression of it and the reduction of it, basically in size and so forth, is also very much an impact on him, of depressing it down so that the view shed is still there. Yes, there are other places in which there's controversy and that there were problems and so forth. The Rhodes Tavern, Metropolitan Square in particular is one of those that still today rings with many people about historic preservation and so forth. And if you're not familiar with it, that's an early view in the upper left. This is the way it looks today on the right. It's across from the Treasury building, which I'm showing the lower left, and then that's the old Rhodes Tavern that is there. On this, as I say, there can be multiple readings on it. Carter did not ultimately, he said that he hoped that the thing could be saved, but he felt that much, much more important than saving the Rhodes Tavern would be saving the Metropolitan Square building, or the Metropolitan building, which was next door. He felt that that was more appropriate for the scale of Washington, D.C., and that indeed the Rhodes Tavern would be like, and I quote here, would be, the poor little beat-up derelict is a sadness from an urban design point of view. And if saved, it would be the rotten tooth in the smile of 15th Street. And I must say, in reading over the testimony on this, it does appear that whether there was really much left of the building and really what it was a very contentious issue. At the same time, though, to note that he was an advocate in other places for other historic preservation, and it is certainly during his time, but also due to Charles Atherton, that historic preservation does become much more of the mantra of the Commission of Fine Arts, that he was in back of the saving of the old post office and the restoration of it, though, as he noted in one of his testimonies on it, that it still didn't take care of the real problem of the Federal Triangle. The real problem of the Federal Triangle, as some wanted, was not to tear it down, but to get rid of that parking lot there. And of course, what results is the Ronald Reagan Building by Pay, Cobb, and Freed and partners. What all of this leads to is my conclusion, and that is that Carter Brown represents an intensely divisive period in the history of Washington's architecture, and that in many ways he was an individual that was able to bring things together, and that he was working with a tremendous crew here at the Commission of Fine Arts, but still at the same time really the support that might have been coming from the Commission and other members was really not there. And what he was able to do was to attempt to try to create an aesthetic for Washington, D.C. that is really at the bottom what the city is all about. Thank you very much.